Now to play around with those operators, I'm back here in the console, this JavaScript console in the DevTools, since we can quickly enter code like this here and instantly see the result, which is more convenient than typing it here and then executing the code and then seeing it here. So that's why we'll continue here. And let's play around with those various operators I showed you. And for example, you see we can compare numbers with each other for equality. And I did mention that we have two kinds of equality operators there, with 2 and with 3 equal signs. Now what's the difference? The difference is that if you use the one with 2 equal signs, you compare the values only. And as a consequence, if you would compare the number 5 with the string 5 with the 2 equal sign operator, you would get true. With the triple equal sign operator, you instead also check for type equality. So for this comparison, you get false because whilst the value is the same, 5, the value type is not the same. One of them is a number and one of them is a string. And these are different value types, as you learned. And therefore, it is generally considered a best practice to always use the triple equal sign operator because typically you should compare equal types. Of course, if you know that you need to compare a string to a number and you want to check for a value only, it is fine to use the double equal sign operator as well. Now we also learned about the negation operator, and there we could check if 5 is not equal to 5, which of course is false because they are equal. And for example, checking if 4 is not equal to 5 therefore would yield true. And here we would also actually get true if I check for 5 not being equal to 5 if the second 5 is a string and the first one is a number. So that's how we could use this negation operator. It also exists on one equal sign only though, and then here I would get false because now again we only have a look at the value. Now besides equality or not equality, we can also check for values being greater or smaller. And for example, we can check if 3 is greater than 1 and if 4 is greater than 6, which of course is not. We can check for A being greater than B, which it is not, because B comes after A in the alphabet. And we can check if CB is greater than AB, which it is, because if you have multiple characters in a string, the characters are compared character by character. So first C and A is compared, and if we have a winner there, then we're done. And only if they would be equal, it would move on to the second character and compare those with each other. But here C is greater than A, and that's why we overall get true for this comparison. And we can also check for equality, so greater or equal, and that would also behave just as you would probably expect it. Now it is worth mentioning that you can't combine the negation operator with those kinds of comparisons just like this. So you can't do that. You see you get an error. Instead here, you would first execute this comparison, wrap it in brackets, and then add your negation operator in front of it, because you can always use this negation operator to convert a true value to false or a false value to true. And that's essentially what we're doing here then. We are first deriving a true or false value, and then we're getting the inverse of it. Now that were our comparison operators. We also got the logical operators. And here we got and or. And here the idea is simply that sometimes we have multiple combined conditions. For example, we could be checking if 5 is equal to 5 and if 3 is equal to 3. And that would return true because both individual expressions here yield true. If we would have at least one expression that yields false, the overall expression would yield false with that and operator. With the or operator, on the other hand, it is enough if at least one of the two expressions yields true. So there, if we had basically the same line of code, but with the OR operator, we would get true now because at least one of the two yields true. Of course, if both yield false, for example, if I change this 5 to a 6, then we would also get back false as an overall result here. Now, it's also worth mentioning that you can combine as many comparisons as you want. For example, we could be saying that we want to check if 2 is equal to 2 or if 2 is equal to 3, and we want to check if 5 is equal to 6. And what you see is that if I would execute this, it would work, and I would get true as an overall result, because by default, this will be evaluated or read like this. JavaScript will first evaluate this part with the AND operator, since this has higher priority in JavaScript. And therefore, the result of this comparison will be false, because both conditions here actually yield false. But even if just one of them would yield false, this would still overall yield false, because that's how the AND operator works. But then you see that the overall result is true, and that tells us that JavaScript then takes the result of this second comparison here with the AND operator, and of course combines this with the first comparison here with the OR operator. And you learned that therefore this overall will yield true if at least one of the two operations that are compared with that OR operator yield true. And that's the case because this first operation yields true. Now, just like in regular math, you can override this built-in priority by adding parentheses. If you want to say that you don't want this second part here to be evaluated first, but instead you first want to check this OR operation and then combine that with the result of this last comparison, you can do this by simply adding parentheses here. Now you see, we overall get false, because now JavaScript will first of all make this evaluation here, and that of course yields true, because, well, both sides of OR return true, but it would even be enough if just one of them would yield true. But then the overall result of this first comparison, of this first evaluation here, is combined with that last comparison with the AND operator, and therefore we overall get false because this yields false. 5 is not equal to 6, and you learned that for AND, both sides need to yield true, and that's not the case here, hence we get false. So you can combine as many comparisons as you want, and you now also learned about the priority of the different operators. And that's it for this introduction to Booleans and these comparison and logical operators. Of course, playing around with numbers in the console like this is not what we would do in real apps, but it is useful to understand these operators. I'm just giving you this overview right now so that we can then use all these features later throughout the course, but of course there you will then also see them in more realistic scenarios. For example, back here in this example code I started with earlier.